All right. And welcome back, you guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hageman. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in. As always, if you are coming from YouTube and you are new to the channel and you want immediate access, you want to be the first group of people notified when videos drop. Videos drop Mondays, Fridays, and Thursdays. Solo episodes every Monday, bi-weekly guest episodes on Friday, and then those medium format videos every Thursday. Supposed to be shorter, easier to digest than the longer form episodes, which I'm also now realizing I'm doing medium clips of those too. So a lot of content. If you want to be immediately notified when they come out, hit the bell button. It helps more than you think in terms of getting the word out about the podcast, in terms of sharing this information with more people. It helps me. It helps others. I appreciate those of you who are already on top of that. As always, if you're interested in one-on-one coaching, if you're interested in consultations, if you're already happy, let's say with your coach, I know I'm going to hit that like within the first 2 minutes. If you're already happy with your coach, but you're like, hey, you know, they don't really do like the lab work thing, the PED thing, or even the training thing. It's very common nowadays. A lot of coaches will kind of give a training split, and you know, it might not be their forte. For a long time, it wasn't mine. If you are worried about there being holes in your game or with your programming or whatever it might be, and you want to kind of set up more of an interdisciplinary team, plug me in, tag me in. That would have probably made more sense. I work with a lot of coaches and clients. A lot of top coaches will use me as a resource. So if that's something that you're like, hey, I'm not looking to switch teams, I'm not looking to switch coaches, but I think you could be a great asset, that is something that I do. All that to say, I have been going through a slump with recording the last few times, and it's not that surprising. I mean, like right now, body fat, it's getting lower, and realistically, like there is less bandwidth. Almost all of it goes into training, yes, but also into the one-on-one client work I do, into the consultations. And, you know, even though I have it segmented up in like a pretty reasonable and organized fashion, recording days. I mean, for the longest time, I've just been batching, and like these days are hefty. But yeah, I mean, like I've seen the decline. I know Emily has. I feel for her. But really, I think like once we got back from Tampa, I hit it super hard. I was like, hey, I know I'm going to get leaner. I know that there's going to be a drop off in cognitive function, focus, and realistically, I want to get ahead. So, I mean, like a lot of March and April was just focused on like, how can I backlog a lot of episodes and get things, you know, ready so that, let's say I am competing, you know, 3-4 weekends in a row, or, you know, maybe there's some travel coming up and I'm not going to be home, not going to be able to bring the lights with me and do all of this, then we're good. We're not missing any episodes. And right now I'm pretty far ahead. So by the time y'all listen to this, you'll probably it'll probably be very clear whether I've competed or not. I'll just say that. Right now it's a little bit up in the air. Got some personal things going on that are very exciting, very positive, not negative. People tend to say, they're like, oh, I you know, couldn't do it for personal reasons. And there's always a negative connotation. I want that to be super clear. No, if I don't compete when this comes out, if I like have kind of shifted directions, it's very much, hopefully, fingers crossed, because of a very exciting opportunity in my personal life. So we'll put a pin in that. But all this to say, recording has been kicking my ass. And I think that's natural. Anyone I talk to, I mean, Jordan's a great example. He's been doing podcasts, been on the internet. I mean, like, I think his podcast, I think they're up to like 600 episodes, but he himself like has been doing content creation. And we talk about this often. It's like, okay, do you feel like you say the same thing again and again? Do you feel like you've said everything that needs to be said? And although there are things like constantly that come up and I'm like, oh, that would be such a great topic. It's like once it comes time to record, I almost begin to doubt that. I almost begin to wonder, you know, is this actually going to make an impact? Is it actually going to be constructed and delivered in a way that's valuable to the viewer, to the listener? So in looking at the analytics, in doing the consultation calls that I've done, in reflecting and listening to my clients. I mean, like the things or the thing largely that I feel like there is a need for, especially now, especially right now, like when this goes out, this will be June or July. We're in the thick of competition season for the physique competitor, male and female. We've got national shows, junior USAs, junior nationals, USAs, nationals, North Americans. I'm for sure forgetting some, but realistically, this is when people are in like the heat of getting their pro card, getting close to getting their pro card, like they're in the thick of it. And it's around this time of year that people tend to scramble, and their, I wouldn't say values, but like their boundaries around like what they would do versus what they said was like a hard rule, is like, I'm not going past this. They begin to waver. And I think a lot of this is influenced heavily by just simply being in a space where it is highly competitive, hearing from other people that there is, you know, maybe some enhancement involved in that individual's prep, and wondering like, you know what, fuck it, is that what's the missing link? Is that the thing that's going to help me enter the IFBB Pro League? And what I'll say, I was of this belief for the longest time. So I did my first cycle of Anavar in 2020. I was not back in the competing circuit, but I was at a point where I was like, I don't really know if I'm going to compete again. I've always wanted to do Anavar. And yes, looking back, like it was very, I wouldn't even say impulsive. It was actually very thought out, but I was very ignorant to what I was signing up for. And it wasn't until I got back into the competing circuit, it wasn't until really I did a few national shows and saw that I was very close, even with very minimal PEDs being introduced. I was like, okay, if I'm going to continue doing this, and this was a decision like I made after I turned pro. When I did my pro debut, I got second at my pro debut to Ashley Kay, and it was very close, and it gave me this I would say, I don't want to say awakening, but like it made me really consider, it was like, if I'm going to continue to compete in this sport, and if I'm going to compete frequently and continue to use PEDs in any capacity, I need to be more informed than what I currently am. Because at the time I was like listening to a lot of people, and people, I would say largely who had my best interest in mind, but a lot of people who are uncertain. And I felt like there was a personal responsibility. If I'm going to go down this route, then I need to be responsible for my actions. And I'll back up even more. I started competing. I started my prep for my first show in 2014. Now, Bikini had been around a few years, I think, at that point. And I knew on the male side, I knew that drugs were involved, but it was so taboo, even in Bikini, let alone like figure and stuff. Like it was very taboo for females to talk about PED use. People I competed with were kind of open about it with me, but I just had like this chip on my shoulder about like, oh man, like that must make things like that much easier, and it must, you know, mean that like that's the, you know, difference in doing well, in winning, and in being super successful. But at the time, I was very fortunate that I had people in my corner who were like, hey, you're 18, you're 19. You don't even know if you like this sport. Like you've only been in it for a couple years. And realistically, you've so much life ahead of you that like, you know, you can probably get to where you want to go and then decide from there. Do you even want to be more muscular? And the big thing, even back then, that was obvious, like was very apparent to me, is that there was a risk associated with using anabolics. And in my mind, it was just using all PEDs. But I knew at the time, I'm like, okay, I've heard girls who have virilized, who have gotten the effects of these PEDs. And realistically, I don't know if I would actually be okay. Like in my mind, I was very dramatic. I'm like, oh, like my whole psyche would be fucked up if my voice changed. And if I didn't even really understand, like past that, what those effects were. It was that ambiguous. And when I decided to do my first cycle, I went with Anavar 2.5 milligrams. And very much I was like, okay, I'm going to watch my voice. I'm going to make sure anatomically things stay the same. I'm trying to think back. Gosh, it was so long ago at this point. I think in my mind I know there was a cutoff date. I was like, I'm not going to just take this indefinitely, but it was very much like going into it, this will be a cycle. And I don't know, there was just like this respect around like, there's no free lunch. And like, even if I'm taking the lowest dose possible and I'm only using it for a short period of time, like realistically, I have to accept that like there still is that chance it might not be the drug I think it's going to be. And it also might, even if it is Anavar, even if I'm doing everything textbook, correctly and safely, shit could change, shit could get weird. And it was really this, I don't know, respect, this interest in understanding, what kind of risk am I taking? What kind of exposure, does this garner? That ultimately led me to start talking about PEDs online. I was very, very nervous in doing so because I felt like, okay, there's no women doing this really at this point. And, being one of the first in the space to, be like, hey, like, here's the difference between these drugs. Here's how much you shouldn't probably take if you care about staying feminine. Diving right in, because that's very much how it felt. I knew that there were a lot of people who were of those same beliefs and mindset, like of a very, I would say, ignorant background when it came to PEDs. And I knew that there was abuse, misuse, and confusion around like what they were actually signing up for. But it didn't like really occur to me. It didn't hit me until several months into coaching, into working with athletes, and really, I'm reluctant to say educating, but like working with individuals one-on-one and educating them, informing them of, I say informing is much less of a liability, informing them of the potential risk associated with these drugs, and also putting them on a path that like, hey, like this doesn't mean like you can't do what you're going to do. Doesn't mean that it's wrong, or I have any personal opinion on it. But if safety is a priority, and if these are the things that matter to you and they actually do, here's a more modest approach you could take prior to taking the one you are planning to. So I say all this, I unpack this for, a good 10 minutes to let you know that we're talking about Anavar again today. Because the scene is much different, and the division in Bikini is much, much different today than it was in 2015, than it was in 2020, than it was in 2022. And where I'm at in prep, I'm honestly I used Anavar in 2020, and I've used it for preps in that essence of like, okay, I'm going to bring a fuller look, but I've never used anabolics in that kind of way in an off season to like drive growth, in more what I would say like a contextual setting for hypertrophy. And where I'm at right now, I'm not necessarily far from my stage weight, and I've definitely built muscle, and I've added size to my glutes, only using TRT, which is like, to me, that is that's commendable. Like that's something I'm very proud of. And the more people I see get on stage who are alluding to, use and extended use, or who are even in a position where they're like, I need to take a step back because like, I don't think I can hang with the current practices. It really makes me think. It's like, okay, like where do I sit on this now? Like currently, where do I draw the line? And, in a way it's very, alluring. It's very attractive to consider like, fuck it. Okay. Like I'll just go straight into a build from here, and I'll just, use some Anavar, use some Primo until I get like, the glutes I want that can be competitive on the pro stage. But realistically, I still have that same concern, already being on TRT and knowing that like, this is something I'm probably going to be on for largely the rest of my life. I don't want to put myself in a position where things start to change. And yeah, there's a lot of individuals who say like Anavar is harmless and you can use it, especially at a low dose. If you can get the dose low enough, then you can use it for an extended period of time. And like, while that is wiser than, yes, using it at a high dose, there still is that fear on my part. What if I regret that decision? What if I put it in place? And I do really well and nothing happens, and then next time I put in place, like immediately something changes. And this is a very real consideration for me with what I'm doing in the space, with the responsibility that I have created for myself, that I'm happy to have to essentially lead by example and do things in a, I would say, relatively transparent way, online, in more of a public eye. And that's why we're talking about this today. Because originally the text, like the script, the thing I wanted to talk about was, should you use Anavar? And I'll say, when I started talking about PEDs, it was a lot easier to say, it was a lot easier to speak in absolutes. It was a lot easier to say it doesn't really have a place almost ever in a contest prep. It's a lot easier to say that, like, if you're escalating the dose or using it multiple times a year, that, you're being a little heavy-handed, and that's not really falling in line with someone who cares about minimizing effects. And, what worries me is now seeing the direction continue to go, the direction of the bikini division continue to go, because it's not just like, I know a lot of these girls' cycles. I know a lot of the coaches' cycles. So like, I can confirm without getting specific, like, many of them are not light. Many of them are very competitive. It doesn't mean that the individuals are not risk averse or are not worried about things changing, but it does put that consideration in my mind that, like, you know what, there's going to be a lot more use, especially with the development of the division and individuals pushing that muscularity. And there are going to be people that maybe not now, maybe they don't run into virilization immediately, but in 3 and 4 and 5 years, maybe it starts to manifest. And that worries me. And it's not something I necessarily want to keep up with. I love having the muscle that I do, and I'm so envious of the glutes that a lot of top girls have. And I want those glutes, but this is where I find myself, at least at this point in contest prep or in a fat loss phase or whatever the fuck I was calling it at some point, this is where I find myself being really thoughtful and really looking inward. I would say, like, tuning out any competitive responsibility I have, because that's simply just not there. But also tuning out, like, okay, well, this is what's possible, but we don't have the context. And this is a conversation, I think, if you're listening to this, if you're still listening to this, I think you should really, really encourage, if you coach people, encourage with your athletes, or if, you're looking inward for yourself, trying to decide, like, is it worth it? Is this something I want to do? I wouldn't make that decision lightly. There's a lot of people who use drugs and they don't experience virilization. I myself am one of them. I have used Anavar 3 times and I've gone unscathed. But I also know those are cards that I played. Like, I have burned through some of the ability to use drugs before that certain point where things start to tip. And really, when I think about these conversations that, I have with myself, but I have with the clients and I have with one-off clients, it still comes down to them asking, should I use Anavar? Would I benefit from using it? And even though now we are, like, legitimately 20 minutes into this episode, that's what I want to kind of walk you through. When it could make sense, how to use it, and that's not a recommendation to use it. But if you're going to, what would make the most sense, what it can do, what it cannot do, and why most people get it wrong. And some of you who are familiar with my content back in, like, 22, 23, maybe this will be a little reminiscent because it is a little more textbook, giving you a little bit of the history, but consider this maybe a crash course on Anavar, at least to the extent that I think is warranted. So if you're not familiar, Anavar, other name for it is oxandrolone. It is a DHT derivative. Now, it was developed in the 60s. It was designed for children, for burn victims, people with muscle wasting diseases. It was never intended for bodybuilders. Now, let me back up. With it being a DHT derivative, it's not aromatizing, meaning that it's not going to have that conversion into estrogen the way testosterone would. So, quick side note, if you have someone who's taking testosterone, and this doesn't largely apply to women, like yes, testosterone still aromatizes in women, but this is much more of a concern in men. If someone's dose of testosterone is too high for what they can tolerate, meaning that they're aromatizing at a rate that now their estrogen is too high, in men, biological men, they can then develop excessive estrogen levels, or I guess that would be quite intuitive. They can then develop gynecomastia, so actual growth of that gland in the breast tissue. So this is not something that is a new concept. I would say it's fairly new in terms of dialogue on this page. Women don't necessarily see that kind of risk to that extent, but we do have to be careful if someone's running a high dose of testosterone, but there are other things we need to consider within that. All that to say, in the case of Anavar, we're not worried about that aromatization. We're not concerned about that conversion of testosterone, or in the case of Anavar, into estrogen. Now, it is one of the most clinically studied anabolic steroids. And because of that, it's something that we do have a lot of insight into its anabolic potential to its androgenic potential. So if you're familiar, no anabolic, no steroid is completely devoid of its androgenic potential. There aren't those that exist right now. Hopefully in our lifetime they will exist. That would be sick. But right now, consider every anabolic steroid. Yes, it has an anabolic potential, but it also has an androgenic potential. Anabolism, think hypertrophy. Androgenicity, think masculine traits. Now, let me be clear. Anavar in itself, yes, it has potential to build muscle, but the degree in which you can add tissue is going to largely be dependent on your propensity to build, whether you're in an environment to support building. It is not a hardener. I can think back to so many times that the first time I used Anavar, I remember being like, oh yeah, it's going to tighten me up. It's going to shred me. It's going to dry me out. It's going to help me lose fat better. That's not what it does. So, if you are like me or were like me, and that's kind of your understanding of it, I want you to erase that, wipe it off the whiteboard and come into this with, it's really good at muscle preservation, and it's good at building muscle in the essence that it can allow you to put on tissue at a faster rate than physiologically you would be able to do naturally. Now, because it is oral, meaning that you are consuming it, ingesting it through your mouth, through the GI tract, it is going to have an impact on your liver. It is going to cause liver enzyme elevation. So ALT, AST. Now, the degree in which it can do this is largely going to be dose dependent, as well as in contrast to the amount of time that you spend on it, that you use it for, the duration. But we do see, especially in male dosing, so if we're looking at 20, 40, 60, 80 milligrams, we can see a pretty significant increase in liver enzymes. So that's a consideration you need to make if you're someone who already has elevated liver enzymes for some reason or another, which there are transient reasons that these enzymes will be elevated. So it's important, again, not to just take a snapshot of your ALT, AST, but we also have to consider whether or not this is a pattern or if this is isolated. Now, the other thing we want to consider, and I'm going to get into the virilization side of this, but I want to talk systemically. I want to talk about other systems first. Lipids, your heart, 20 milligrams a day can decrease good cholesterol, so HDL, by 30%. Again, maybe this isn't a consideration if we're not talking about a dose that high, if we're talking about a much lower dose. But if we're talking about males, if we're talking about individuals who are using higher doses, it needs to be a consideration, especially if you are in a fat loss phase and healthy fats are limited. Even more so if you have any other comorbidities that impact your cardiovascular system. Now, this is where, as men and women, we need to be considerate of this. This is the answer to why can't I just run Anavar in itself? Why can't I do an Anavar-only cycle? very common question. Really haven't talked about this in a long time, so enjoy. Endocrine suppression. Now, doses 20 to 40 milligrams can reduce testosterone by almost 50%. Now, some of y'all might be thinking, well, I'm a woman, I'm not going to use 20 or 40 milligrams. I was going to go for 5 or 10 or maybe 15. Sick. But consider the fact that your testosterone probably is already low. Even if you are an outlier and it's like 40 nanograms per deciliter, there's still going to be some kind of impact there. And really, why I think this is important that we acknowledge is if that suppression is occurring while you're using Anavar, yes, it can allow you to build muscle at a faster rate. But realistically, if you're someone who is trying to do things like you're trying to check every single box, we don't want to have you low test. We don't want to have a hypoandrogenic environment. I would rather someone get the most out of what they can, either first naturally or with something that would modulate TRT, modulate testosterone, something like TRT or even something like DHEA, if that is tolerable for the individual, then just simply going, cool, I'm going to put Anavar in place to act as almost a TRT. I like to have stability there. We do know that testosterone, yes, it has a higher anabolic to androgenic ratio. However, we also have physiological thresholds in which we know virilization shouldn't occur. We can also measure it in blood. Like we can see it in our lab values. You can't get Anavar measured in your blood work. You can't see how effective it is. You're kind of just waiting for good or bad, and it's not a buffet. You can't really select to the degree in which you're going to experience one or the other. Now, because it has a very short half-life, 9 hours with a peak of 1 hour, meaning we should be taking it if we're using Anavar within that 1 hour time frame relative to training, because ultimately we are trying to drive training performance. Because of that, we need to dose daily. So with injectables, I mean, like realistically, you could create more stability in your levels by dosing daily. But with an injectable, you're also looking at a longer half-life for the most part. So you're going to be able to get away with less injections, less frequent administration. Anavar, it's taken daily though. Now, I've kind of already covered some of the ways that people misuse it. But really to get like very rudimentary, I think that misuse often comes down to using it at the wrong time, using it for the wrong intention, or just using too much of it or using it for too long. So when we unpack this, using it at the wrong time, I mean, this kind of coincides with using it for the wrong intention. In the case that you're using it in contest prep, the primary goal is really muscle retention. We're preventing muscle wasting. Realistically, there's a lot of scenarios where someone will feel as if they built muscle. And I can tell you, like, one of the best ways to look like you built muscle is by losing body fat if you already have muscle underneath. It happens all the time where people will be at a very healthy, very modest body fat, yet they strip down, maybe 5 pounds, and people begin to comment like, oh, you look like you added some weight. You look like you built some muscle. It's just the fact that body fat does skew that visual appearance. I'm kind of getting beside the point, but realistically, in the case of a contest prep, it is used to drive training performance. It is used to artificially inflate the look that you bring to stage, to bring something that's a little fuller. I can say last time I competed, I got on stage at like 117 at about 5'4", and I was very flat, very wispy, very praying mantis-like. And I did a show a few weeks later with Anavar, with a proper carb load, with little to no cardio, and I was as full as I could be. And I got on stage at 124-ish. It worked, but to the extent that it could work. I didn't have enough muscle for it to make this, 10-pound difference, but it is something that a lot of people use towards the tail end of their contest prep, which I don't necessarily think is misuse. Really, when I start looking at misuse, it's in the state that training performance doesn't really need to be upregulated. Like, you just started a fat loss phase, and this is where even like sitting down to record this, like I find myself going back and forth. I'm like, well, like, yeah, even with TRT, I probably lost some muscle this prep. Like there's some degree of muscle loss that probably will occur. And, you know, theoretically, could you put an Anavar for the entirety of the entire, like the whole prep, just to make sure that everything is like just tipped off? Sure. But it doesn't come for free. Like there's a cost associated with that. And that's what worries me. That's what worries me about like you guys listening to this, you ladies who are competing, who are getting ready for shows, is that some of y'all have had in 5 to 10 milligrams of Anavar just to sustain a really extreme diet because you had a lot of weight to lose. And like, that's not shade. I started my diet at 152. I am like a little over 132 right now, and I still have a little bit to go. And I can say like, it, you know, does make sense now. It's like, yeah, the more time we have to spend getting down, the higher risk there is a muscle loss. And if we don't have anabolics to really preserve that, that can be a bitch. Like that can be something that then puts us in a position where maybe we're more likely to lose muscle. But all that to say, even if you have a lot of body fat to get off, the answer isn't just simply putting in Anavar and crushing yourself. There are much, I would say, wiser approaches that don't expose you to that same risk of virilization. Now, when we look at misuse, using it for the wrong thing, using it as a fat burner, using it as a hardener, I think largely most women are going to find that once they put in Anavar, and I mean, like I'm talking, I have women with tiny, like little itty bitty waist, and they find that once it goes in, they start to feel not distension, but like fullness in their abdomen. And the best way I can explain this is like, we can't be selective with like the way we lose body fat. We can't be selective with the receptors that Anavar targets. And I know for me, like I'm very sensitive and I would say aware of shifts in my stomach. And I have good musculature in my abdomen, but pulling intramuscular glycogen, pulling water into these muscles, it's not like I can say when I have Anavar in place, oh, just go to my glutes, don't go to my legs, don't go to my core, go to my shoulders. We want it in the shoulders. And it's something almost every time that I've had it in, I've definitely felt a fullness that I'm not used to. I felt not necessarily a bloat again, but just like thickness. And as soon as it's removed, that goes with it. I find that a lot of people who are using it recreationally are unprepared to experience that aspect of it, that fullness, and especially ones that are very sensitive to changes in scale weight overnight. I mean, like you're looking at, you know, a 2 to 5 pound increase, and like that can be very off-putting if like seeing it go up 1 pound is upsetting for you. So being in a fat loss phase, having unrealistic expectations, I think that's a shame. But also just looking at it primarily as like, what is it good at? It does work on fat loss pathways, but very minimally. And that's not something that like I feel is at all responsible to like as educators in the space to be like, oh, Anavar works on this pathway and it can do that. Like I feel like that's just misleading people and encouraging misuse. So shame on you if you're doing that. And I'm not really talking about anyone specific. I know in the last couple years, there's been this heightened growth around like people just like looking into these compounds being like, this is what it does. And like latching on to one aspect without context. And then, you know, making a video about it, putting it out there and not realizing that like you could very well be responsible for people now using this drug in this way. And I just feel like if you're going to talk about drugs, like there is a responsibility to depict it accurately, to not oversell it. And if you are like promoting it in some way, like being really honest, like, okay, what about the person who has a negative experience about, in the use that was, I don't know, catalyzed by the information that you provided. I'll digress. So fat loss, it's just not the best use for it. And like, that's where if the goal is fat loss, I would much rather use something like Clen, T4, T3, even growth hormone. I would use something that's going to actually encourage lipolysis, something that is going to do a good job of better creating a deficit. The other aspect to this is Anavar being labeled as a hardener. it being used as something to dry you out. And realistically, there isn't a pharmacological pathway that Anavar or really any oral anabolic directly makes you look harder. And this is, again, where we have to be really careful when we're talking about it. I've caught myself several times where I'm like, oh, like I look really dry today, or I look really tight. And I have to think about, I'm like, okay, it's not because of the inclusion of one variable or really the modification of one variable. If anything, putting in Anavar, yes, it's going to help you maintain muscle. It's going to support performance, but that look is a consequence of really a combination of low enough body fat, lower cortisol, low water, and full glycogen, not just the anabolic, not Anavar in itself. And that's where the same rule of thumb applies to using any of these fat loss agents. Like, they can cause transient shifts in the composition, how you look, but realistically, the thing that's going to allow you to look hard, allow you to look dry, is one, having as little body fat as you need to achieve the look that you're going for, which could vary drastically depending on what that look is. And then two, having enough muscle, making sure that once you peel back the layers, you're not left with very like wispy, faint tie-ins. And like in my mind, I can think back to the times that I have gotten super lean and I've like loved, some aspects of the look, but then I've been like, oh, like if I had more muscle, this would look really wild. Like that would absolutely enhance this physique. So it comes down to a combination of those two things. Also being in a state where, you're able to sleep, you have low cortisol, you're not like having these weird GI shifts that are muddying that look. Now, I talked about two other aspects of misuse, using too much and using it for too long. Now, for both men and women, there are major considerations into what is too much, what is too long. But what I'll say is that for women, total global lifetime exposure, that is what's going to tip the scale in the probability that you could experience virilization. Virilization being deepening of the voice, clitoromegaly. Sure, we can get more into the superficial effects, acne, hair growth, hair loss. But realistically, I would err on the side of, if you're going to use Anavar, staying in that very modest conservative range of 2.5 milligrams a day, maybe 5 milligrams a day. And in the case that you're like, hey, I've tried 5 and it didn't yield the results that I wanted, and like I have a lot of runway to use drugs, maybe you do escalate up. But what I'll say, this justification, it tends to take place in moments of desperation. Not all the time, but at times very much people can convince themselves that like that goalpost can be moved. And that they're more okay with, being a little more heavy-handed. And realistically, that's not my call to make. It's not my call to say that, like, if something does change, that's no longer feminine. I think that's completely on you to define, to decide, and to assess. But I would much rather someone start with the lowest dose possible, so 2.5 or 5 milligrams, and work up from there as needed. Not in a single cycle, not the following cycle, but really be honest with themselves around how much muscle do you have to build? What is the effort that you've made outside of just the drug in order to build that muscle? What's your success rate like? Do you have a high propensity to build muscle? Are you someone that really struggles to build muscle? And are you doing anything to hinder that muscle growth that realistically could allow you to get more out of less? And again, you want to use more, you want to use it to preserve muscle, okay? Just be informed. Just be informed about the risk when you're using it, whether you believe how you're using it is safe or, a little more aggressive, a little riskier. So what about using it for too long? Same idea here, same considerations. Will it make a difference if you put it in place? Are you in a position where like that difference in the physique will actually award you like a top placing that will be life-changing or be meaningful enough to justify that potential risk? Let me be clear. Like for some people, it is just a matter of getting on the stage. It's not my place to say that it's not warranted or not, but realistically, I can say that like I've used it in times where I've been like, this is very temporary. This is going to help, augment the look slightly, but really where the magic is going to happen, where I'm going to make significant changes to my physique, is not through using it for the last 4 weeks of contest prep. It's going to come from spending intentional time trying to put on muscle. And realistically, I would say, like, if you are on the cusp of, I want to use it, but I'm not sure it's warranted. If it's not something that you're very certain about, there's nothing wrong with waiting. If it's something that you're questioning, like, could I do a little bit more? You might be able to. And hopefully you're in a position with your support system, with your coach, where you have someone who cares about your best interest, really telling you, like, hey, if this is your goal, it does come with this risk, but this is needed at this point. Like, you've truly maxed out your natural potential. I wouldn't take that. I would really consider the sourcing of where that's coming from and whether or not there's a motive there, because I can tell you I've had time and time again girls who come to me who they've signed up with a coach, and within the first 3 to 4 weeks, they are given that line, you've maxed out your natural potential. The only way that you're going to do well is using Anavar or Primobolan or a different anabolic. And maybe that's the case. But generally who I am, I'm very skeptical. And when I have someone come to me who says that they've maxed out their natural potential and they're ready to use anabolics, almost like unanimously, almost every single time, I've taken them through a sound build, like a phase where I'm like, yeah, like, let's really make sure there's nothing more we could do here. And it becomes very apparent that the things that will make the most difference, the training, the adherence, the fucking just intensely training like you want to look like a different person in a year, that in fact was not being maximized. But very much I can respect in their head, they're like, I reached the point where I either didn't know what to do or wasn't willing to do anymore. That it did make sense, because Anavar or another anabolic was the only thing at that point I was kind of willing to put in. I was the only thing I was willing to modify. And there's a big difference between that and actually reaching your genetic, your physiological, your physical potential. I think it very well could make sense if you are risk averse, if you're not someone who is open to incurring unwanted effects, androgenic effects, to have some kind of hard cutoff. And for me, in my mind, 8 weeks, like, you can do a lot with an anabolic in 8 weeks. And depending on how much muscle you need to build, like, if it's more, then yeah, this might take multiple cycles, or it might take accruing some of that tissue prior to putting the anabolic in place, taking the anabolic out, continuing to try to accrue that tissue. So it might take a little bit longer. It probably will. But realistically, in the case that you're someone who's like, okay, what is the hard cutoff? I would say at 8 weeks, there should be a justification that it needs to stay in. And I've had clients who've been in prep who have competed in very long seasons, and we've assessed at the 8-week mark, and we're like, you know what, okay, a couple more weeks, like, nothing's changed, we're okay. But in the future, that also is a consideration with someone who's then doing a longer prep. How long can we actually ride this out? Now, under 6 weeks, in the case of a contest prep where we're just like pushing fullness and like truly, like, we're not trying to build new tissue, it's like, it could make sense to just have it in transiently for a couple weeks. But I would say realistically, if we're in an off season, if we're looking at a phase where like the goal truly is to look differently at the end of the phase, then I think we should err on the side of not having it in for too short of a period. And especially if the client needs multiple pounds of muscle and this is like, okay, it's a final push, like, we're going to see what we can get out of it, I think it's warranted to keep it in somewhere between, let's just say, 5 to 8 weeks. I think 6 weeks, I think that's going to give us enough time to really assess, like, what did this actually do for us? And I think in the case someone just wants to throw it in an off season for 2-3 weeks, I think we're probably going to be in a position where, yeah, it drives up some training performance, but it doesn't really move the needle in terms of how they look. For me, I would rather have someone be ready or very close to ready in terms of conditioning before we put it in. But I mean, there are absolutely cases where someone has a higher risk tolerance, where maybe we see performance is declining and it does make sense. Let's put this in a little sooner. But realistically, in a contest prep, it's going to be really good at driving training performance, which I would say, again, for risk averse, it should be declining. And if it's not declining, like, maybe we can get more out of this. Or in the case of acute muscle preservation, so in the case that someone is like shrinking and like they still need to get a little bit leaner, but like the muscle's kind of going too, yeah, Anavar, I'm going to say is going to be more preferable than Winstrol, which like largely in Bikini, this isn't one that nowadays I get a ton of questions on, typically from the other divisions, wellness, figure, women's physique, which I'm actually going to do after this one, an all-inclusive video on Winstrol. But if we're just splitting hairs and saying like, okay, which one would be better, I'm going to lean towards Anavar. Now, what about in the off season? Is there an exception? Can you use Anavar being an oral, or is it always 100% of the time Primobolan or Mastron? Now, I think there's a strong argument to use the thing that you think is the drug that you're trying to use. There's been several instances where clients have gone to that next step. They've sent off the drug, the medication, and they've gotten tests back. And I can tell you that there have been times where an individual has two different sources of Anavar. One has come back as no anabolic present. The other has come back at a very high percentage of that drug actually being Anavar. So yes, it is important, and it's something that like we can't be 100% certain of. And even with testing, like you have to assume that batch to batch, there could be some variance. So in the case that you are working with a non-prescription source, I would definitely recommend speaking, if you can, to other people. Hopefully you have some kind of reference there, seeing what their experience has been. And especially if you're females, like I would just bite the bullet. I would just get it tested if you have the funds to do so. And if you don't, I would be very sensitive and very hypercritical of any changes, especially changes that happen very quickly. And spoiler, if changes do happen, really the only thing you can do at that point is discontinue the drug. You guys, like I said before, it is very important on the female side of things to be aware that Anavar is not risk-free. It is not 100% safe for women. There is a risk that comes with using it for however long you use it, and for whatever dose you use it as. The longer that is and the higher that dose, that is going to tip the scale and increase your probability. So for me, I would really go in and be considerate around this question. Is this something that you want to do? And are you okay with things potentially changing? Now, last thing I'll say on this, don't skip having a very clear idea of where you're at hormonally. It's good to have this foundation. So before you add an Anavar or really any other oral, make sure that you have a baseline around your circulating androgens. Make sure that if, let's say you have a high degree of free test, that you're aware of this. If your DHEA is on the higher side, if SHBG is super low, if DHT is already high. Anavar, yes, despite being mildly suppressive, it will still have suppressive properties on androgen production. And if you go in with already low levels, you risk flattening that out. So for me, I would really, really encourage you to have blood work done prior to, and even if you're on TRT, just be very aware that you are measuring the peak, not the trough of those testosterone levels 24 hours after your injection, making sure that levels have been stable for roughly 4 to 5 weeks. That's going to give you a lot of the information that you need. And I know like this whole video probably sounds like I'm just demonizing Anavar, but I hope it comes across. I hope you hear what I'm saying now is like, it can be used, it can be misused, and it oftentimes is misused. And that's why I wanted to make this video, is because I want you to be informed. I want you to be clear on what you're doing, and I don't want you to make a very silly or an obvious mistake. It's not the answer. If you're not in shape, if you're not lean enough, and if you don't have enough muscle, there very well could be alternatives that you could consider, non-pharmacological alternatives, but it is a clinical grade performance tool. And if used the right way, it can do a really good job at what it's good at doing. But please don't take this as anything other than me giving you information. This isn't guidance. This isn't a recommendation. No, I do not, advocate for sharing sourcing. But if you found this helpful, definitely let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.